invite you to remain standing for our scripture reading. We'll read from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5. Let's read God's good word together. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their parents in the other boat, and they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Okay, so Simon's parents were not in the next boat. I swear I can read. But, I'm Brandon Blackstone, the executive pastor here. It's great to be with you. And I had the privilege of growing up in the dubious time known as the late 90s. Anyone else? Well, you don't have to date yourselves. But I grew up during that time, late 90s, early 2000s, and we had some particular fashion choices that we made at that time. And I unfortunately fell prey to some of them. Others I probably did not miss because of any great awareness. Just I didn't have access to money and stuff, so I didn't buy them. But around whenever I was late elementary, early middle school was when wide-legged pants were really in. This was the era of JNCOs. Anyone remember that particular plague that was visited upon us? And your coolness was directly proportional to the width of the leg of your pants. And that's how it was. And I remember whenever these came out, all of my friends, it felt like all of my friends were getting them. I was like, "Mom, you have to buy me JNCOs. I have to have some." And she was like, "I'm not spending $50. This was the late 90s. 27, 28 years of inflation. I'm not spending $50 on some jeans that you're going to outgrow in 6 months." And I was like, "Mom, this is the end of the world. I cannot show my face." And I get it now. My mom's here, so thanks, Mom, for trying to protect me. Unfortunately, I was not wise enough to receive wisdom at the time. But I remember, it seemed like my friends had these cool clothes, and I did not. I remember one day walking into class, and one of my friends looking at me, and as I was walking in, and of course in my memory, like every cool person in the world was sitting right there, and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, tight pants." Can you imagine anything worse to say to somebody? In 1997, for a sixth grader, no, there was nothing worse. I remember just feeling at that moment, it's kind of ridiculous. It is patently ridiculous now. But at the moment, it did not feel ridiculous. It felt like everyone else was part of the in crowd, and I did not belong. I was walking into that moment just feeling like I don't belong. Maybe, have you ever felt that feeling of just, I do not belong here. I'm not good enough to be here. I'm not worthy to be here, and just how crushing that can be. That's what we're going to talk about today, is what happens whenever we experience that, and how can we help other people not experience that. And so we're in week 2 of a sermon series called Reckless Love, and we're looking at the love that Jesus has for us and the love that we see in the Gospels that at the time looked reckless to other people, of Jesus reaching out to people that people didn't think he should be reaching out to, and healing people like lepers, and not only healing them, but actually reaching out and physically touching them whenever he did so. You also notice that Jesus heals some people without touching them, but the leper he touched. And that was not, you were not supposed to touch a leopard, or else a leper. You shouldn't touch a leopard either. It's for a different reason. But he crossed that boundary, and it looked reckless to other people. That's the way that God loves us, and the kind of love that God invites us to embody for other people. And so that's what we're looking at. We started with the great commandment. Jesus tells us the greatest commandment is to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is like it, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so that's the starting point. That's what Pastor Mark taught us about last week. And what he taught us was that loving God enables me to love my neighbor, and loving my neighbor enables me to love God. These two things are connected. You don't get one without the other. And it's not just you do one and then you do the other, but they're absolutely connected. And whenever we love our neighbor, we're loving God. Whenever we love our God, it leads to loving our neighbor. And we know this because we read it in 1 John. This is what it says, "Beloved, let us love one another because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God." Read this part with me. "Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." John's not really mincing words, is he? Right? I mean, he tells it like it is. If you say you love God and don't love your neighbor, then you're not telling the truth, because those two things are absolutely integrally related. And what Jesus' goal was, as he was teaching and embodying these things, is nothing less than our full transformation into the loving nature of God. Our full transformation into the loving nature of God. Anyone accomplish that so far? Like put on the full nature of God? That's kind of a high aspiration. And yet that's what Jesus invites us into. That's his goal for us. And I don't think, I know a lot of you. I don't think any of us are there yet. And that was a joke. I'm not throwing daggers. Anyway, we're not there yet, but that's our aspiration. That's where he's inviting us to. That's what he's teaching us how to become. And we see wisdom from throughout the centuries about how we do this. And I really love this teaching from a monk named Dorotheus of Gaza from the 6th century. This is what he said. He says, "Each one according to his means," that means each one as they're able, "should take care to be at one with everyone else. For the more one is united to his neighbor, the more he is united with God." And so these two things absolutely go together. And he even went on to illustrate this. I don't think he had graphic design software. He couldn't just jump on Canva, but he was probably maybe drawing in the dirt. And so what he says is, imagine that there's a circle that represents the world, and God is like a dot in the center of the circle, right, like that. And then imagine that lines coming toward the center are human lives. And what you notice is you see the lines, all of those are different human lives. As they get closer to the center, they're closer to one another, right? And so whenever they're at the diameter of the circle, they're further. Then whenever they move inward, they're closer to one another. And the closer they get, and whenever they're one with each other, they're one with God. And so that's what he says, is these two things go together. And if you're coming closer together and getting further away from other people, then you're probably not actually coming closer to God, right? If you're going to church a lot and going to Bible study a lot and you're really hateful to people outside of that, then Bible study's not helping. We've got to change tactics, right? Probably you've met people like that, who spend a lot of time in church and talk like they're super holy, and the way that they treat people makes you question the way that they talk. And that's what happens, is if we're not loving our neighbors, then we have to question, am I really loving God? And so that's because that's what he also says is if you're going further away from the center, if you're going further away from other people, you're going further away from the center as well, and vice versa. And so what Jesus is inviting us into is to come closer to the center and coming closer to our neighbors as well. And what that looks like, to use a different circle metaphor, so pause this one and move on to the next, what it looks like is expanding the circle. And what we see in the life of Jesus is that it starts with us. It starts with ourselves. And so that's where we pick up with Jesus in his teaching that we shared together. So early in his ministry, his reputation was spreading, and people started crowding around to hear him. And at one point, he was surrounded on a lakeshore by people who wanted to hear his teachings. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever tried to address a group with someone like this far away from you, it doesn't work very well, right? You have to get some space. Like, there's a reason that I'm on an elevated platform right here. Also, I have speakers. Those help as well. Jesus did not have speakers, though, as far as we know. And so what he did was he actually needed to get a different kind of amplification. And so Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God. And he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowd from the boat, because sound carries over water. Have you ever been on the shore and there's somebody way out in the lake and you can hear every word that they're saying, like as if they're right there by you? So also, if you go out in two different boats with groups of people, don't talk about people in the other boat, because they'll be able to hear you, right? not related to what we're talking about today, just a free tip. And so he goes out into the water. He's talking because the water allows people to hear him. And after he finishes, he tells Simon to throw his nets back out. And so when he'd finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." Now, one of the frustrating things whenever you're reading the Bible is that it doesn't tell you like tone. Like, I wonder if this was like Peter responded sarcastically, like, "If you say so, we'll throw out the nets. I'm just the one who's been fishing my whole life and caught nothing. But I'm sure you who like know how to talk a lot professionally can teach me where to find fish." Now, maybe that's not what's going on. Maybe it was like, "If you say so," right? It's which word are you emphasizing? Okay, that doesn't have to do with anything. But Peter, whether reluctantly or enthusiastically or somewhere in between, says, "I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So Peter's been fishing for a long time, both that day and in his career, and knows the lake well. And so all of a sudden, if he can fish all night and catch nothing, and then throw out his nets and instantly have this massive catch, he knows that this is not just like luck that has brought him upon a good fishing spot. Like there's a greater power at work. And his response is to be struck by his own unworthiness. After seeing Jesus' power on display, Simon is struck by his own unworthiness to be near Jesus. And this is what he says. When Simon saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And what Jesus says to him is not, "You're right, you are unworthy, please get out of my way." What he says to him is, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching people. I will make you fish for people." And what he says in other Gospels is, "Come and follow me." He invites him to be a part of what he's doing. And yet Simon is feeling rejected and like he's unworthy to even be in Jesus' presence. And what's really important for us to notice and not skip by is the fact that it was Simon and not Jesus who rejected Simon. Jesus is not the one who said, "You are unworthy, get away from me." He says, "Come and follow me." Simon's the one who's saying, I cannot even be here. I do not belong here. I do not have the right pants. I'm obviously a loser. Get away from me, Jesus. Right? And he's saying, I do not belong in the same space as you. And yet Jesus invites him in, invites him to become part of his circle. And in fact, he ends up becoming part of his inner circle. He's renamed Simon Peter, and I'll call him both names because I can't remember to stick with one. But he becomes one of Jesus' closest followers and the foundation of the entire church that we're still a part of today. And yet his initial response was to reject himself, to say, "I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. Get away from me. I've got to get away from you because I don't deserve to be here." And what happens is that our feelings of shame, they limit our ability to love ourselves and to accept love. We are so convinced of our own unworthiness that it prevents us from being able to receive love or to accept it. And I've really been helped by Brené Brown's teaching about this. Maybe you've heard of her. She sold like 100 million books or something. And this is what she says. She says, "Shame is the intense, painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection," which is what we see in Simon's experience. He says, "Get away from me. I'm unworthy to be around you." And she makes this really helpful distinction, I think, between guilt and shame. She says guilt equals I did something bad. Shame equals I am bad. And so maybe you've been in a situation where you've snapped at someone who didn't deserve it, or maybe they did. That part doesn't really matter. But you've thought, I really shouldn't have done that. Guilt is the feeling that I did something wrong, and I need to go apologize. I need to make amends for this relationship that I've hurt. Shame is, I can't believe I did that. I'm such a terrible person. I'm always doing that, and I'm awful. Probably I'm going to die friendless because I'm such a bad friend. And that which leads you just to do nothing. Because if the problem is you, what's the point? Why apologize? You're just going to mess it up next time. And so it's really important for us to know that distinction, because whenever we get trapped in those feelings of shame, it makes it impossible for us to have relationships, or at least to have them at the depth that we could. Our capacity to love others is limited by our capacity to love ourselves and receive God's love, to accept that we are loved. And whenever we're looking at the greatest commandment that Jesus teaches, I think it's really important for us to notice what he doesn't say. The greatest commandment is not to love your neighbor more than yourself. It's to love your neighbor as yourself. So love your neighbor as yourself. And so every Wednesday, the pastors and some of the staff and a few church members come up to hear the sermon and then to give feedback so that we can make it better. And I'm just thinking, if Jesus was like workshopping this sermon with me, like I could have helped him, and he didn't ask. But if he had asked and he was like, so Brandon, what do you think? I'm thinking, like, I'll quote Leviticus, I'll say, love your neighbor as yourself, and be like, Jesus, that is great. But if you wanted to make it even greater, love your neighbor more than yourself. Think how self-sacrificial that sounds. And Jesus is like, wow, I don't know anything about self-sacrifice, right? And but that sounds better. And yet that's not what he says. Or at least in our minds it sounds better. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. Because we have to love ourselves to be able to love our neighbor. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not a competition. We don't have to love ourselves less. We do have to love ourselves in the right way. But we don't have to love ourselves less. In fact, we have to accept that we are loved, that we are worthy of love, and offer that to ourselves to be able to offer it to others. I love the way that the theologian Paul Tillich puts it. He says we have to accept that we are accepted, and that can be really hard to do. And yet it's absolutely vital that we not reject ourselves whenever God has not rejected us. This is what Henry Nouwen, the great spiritual teacher, says. He says, self-rejection is the greatest enemy of the spiritual life, because it contradicts the sacred voice that declares we are loved. It contradicts the voice of God that says, you are my beloved child, and you I am well pleased, whenever we can't love ourselves, whenever we reject ourselves out of hand. And so we have to start, if we're going to love others, we've got to start with loving ourselves, with not rejecting ourselves, because Jesus has not rejected us. And if we reject ourselves, we might be implying that we know better than he does, right? I mean, actually, Peter, or actually Simon, whatever your name is at that part of the gospel, you are worthy. I've made you worthy. Come and follow me. And that's the invitation that he gives to all of us. You are worthy. I've made you worthy. Come and follow me. I love you. Receive my love. Love yourself. He offers us healing and healing for our shame and forgiveness for all of our guilt so that we can move forward, so that we can be healed of the wounds that have been inflicted on us, that we've inflicted on ourselves, and that we've suffered, so that we can go forward and share the love that he offers to all of us. And here's the really funny thing. There's kind of a contradiction in the Christian life, is that kind of the deeper we go, we become more and more aware of our limitations, of our shortcomings, that we don't measure up, and yet we become less and less given to self-rejection, because we know more and more how deeply we're accepted, and that overcomes all of it. And you come to points when you're like, man, God, I really thought that I would have been past this by now. Like, I thought we took care of that like 2 years ago, and you healed me of all of that. And he's like, yeah, Brandon, I know that you thought that. and we're still on this journey together. And yet we can receive that and know that our acceptance is not conditional based on it. That's the contradiction, is that we become more and more aware of our limits and sinfulness and less given to self-rejection. That's the gift that Jesus offers to us. And once we can accept that for ourselves, then we can offer it to others. We can expand the circle for others as well. And so back to where we were in the scriptures, Simon and James and John have been invited to follow Jesus. And then they go and Jesus does some teaching, he performs some miracles, and then they encounter someone that Jesus also invites to follow him, but it's going to be someone that Simon will have difficulty accepting. And so this is what happens. After they went out from the teaching that they were doing and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." And he got up, left everything, and followed him. Now, you may know tax collectors were not super well looked upon in that day, and it's because they were traitors to their own people. The people had been conquered by Rome, and basically the tax collectors were Jews who had decided that they would take money for Rome and then give it to the people who were oppressing them, who had conquered them. And not only that, but the way that they got paid was by taking extra. So the extra that they took was how they got made. So basically, they had betrayed their people. No one particularly liked them, and probably the Romans didn't even like them. They just saw them as useful people for their purposes. And so Jesus goes to these people, and I'm sure at this point we don't know his response. I mean, maybe he was completely. Well, we know Peter wasn't completely made perfect at this point because he has a few bumps later on. But we don't know. But probably Peter was like, "Why is this guy invited to the party? Like, I didn't know that this was what I was signing up for. Jesus, are you just letting anybody in?" And here's the thing: we always have to fight the temptation to close the door behind us, right? Thank you so much for accepting me. Wow, I can't believe that I'm welcome here, that I'm worthy to be a part of this. But let's make sure our standards don't get too low. Does this thing have a deadbolt? Can we make sure? Is the security alarm on? We're not going to let just anybody into this party, right? I mean, it's amazing to see how quickly that switch can flip, right? Whenever we're on the outside, we really want to be in. And then whenever we're on the inside, we're like, I don't know, should we let other people in? Maybe we need it. I think the group is pretty good as it is. Why would we mess that up? But Levi was excited. He probably did not expect, he's like, follow you, like, is there somebody else that you were talking to named Levi? I think you might have us mixed up. Do you know I'm a tax collector? And I'm still invited. So he's so excited that he throws a banquet. And this is what Luke says. He threw a great banquet for Jesus in his house. And there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. The Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, I may not be reading this right, but I'm pretty sure for them to be asking the disciples at the banquet, it means the Pharisees were at the banquet too. Anyway, okay. Anyway, I don't know what to make of that. But they asked that. But it may have been, this is what Bishop Tom Berlin says. He says, Peter was probably wondering the same thing, right? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? I thought this was the Messiah, the chosen one. I thought that's who I was following. And yet this guy is just eating with whoever, and even it seems like picking out the worst. And yet what Jesus says is those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I've come not for the righteous, not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. I've come for everybody who needs help. And by the way, that's all of us, right? Not just the people we look down on or think we're better than or further along, however we want to spend that. That's for all of us. And so he invites not only these fishermen, which probably Peter never would have become a fisher if he had any prospects about becoming a rabbi. Like somebody else would have taken him as an apprentice before then. And yet that was not the path that he was on. And so Jesus had chosen Simon Peter and invited him to be part of his inner circle. And then he goes and invites someone else who is unworthy, and maybe even worse, a tax collector. And so anyway, Levi's probably feeling pretty good. He's like, wow, I'm in this club. It's great to be here. But then Jesus invites someone who, from his perspective, is even worse. He invites Simon the Zealot. Now, Zealots were kind of a political movement that saw the Romans as the enemies and thought that violence was justified to push them out. I mean, they were willing to kill in order to get them to set their land free. They were revolutionaries. And so they were trying to overthrow people. And what do you think they thought about their own people who collaborated with the enemy? They did not like them. And so after inviting Levi, Matthew, the same name, he goes by different. Everybody's got like two names in the Bible, and if you haven't caught that. But he invites the tax collector into the circle and then invites a zealot who would have wanted to kill him. And Matthew's like, are we sure about this? Like, Jesus, at least we don't have to be roommates, right? And Jesus is like, we're traveling on the road, we're sleeping outside. That concept does not apply. But they're all brought into this group, people who would not only wouldn't have liked each other, but would have been actually enemies in the most literal way. This is what Bishop Berlin says. He says, Christ shows us that the only way to learn the greatest commandment is to have people in our lives who we personally find so difficult to love that we have to get up every morning and pray to our Creator for a love we could not produce on our own. Does anyone come to mind when you read that? Like, oh yeah, I've got that person in my life. Right? I mean, we have these people, and I've got to tell you, most of the time, my response is not to pray, God, help me to love them as best I can. It's like, God, help me not to cross their path today. Help me not have, I will, if you do not take me by them, then I will not think or say bad things to them, and that'll be a win, right? And yet that's not what Jesus does. He's like, okay, bring it together. We're all family now. You don't kill him. You don't cheat him, and figure it out. Figure it out. Jesus brings us these people that we never would have chosen for ourselves and makes us family. And not the family we would have chosen, and yet it's the family that we need if we're going to follow him. And so I wonder as you think about this in your life, as those people come to mind of, oh, yep, that's the person I've got to pray for extra grace for, where do you need to expand the circle in your life? And here's the thing, God has made us wonderfully and just crazily different in a way that makes us crazy. And yet when the people in our circles are only like us, we miss out on the growth and the beauty that God desires to share for us. And more we're retreating to our own circles, only hanging out with people that think like us, that are like us, and think the same things. We can curate our online exposure so we're only seeing nobody who will challenge our thoughts, and we can just build straw men of everyone else, right? And yet that's not the world that God has created for us. God has made us wonderfully diverse, and we look at it as a threat, and yet it's God's gift to us. All of these people. Simon was a gift to Levi, to Matthew, and I imagine it took them a while to figure that out. And yet Jesus didn't call them by accident. He called them both for a purpose. And so as you're thinking about your relationships, you may be familiar with the work of Robin Dunbar, who's an Oxford researcher. Dunbar's number, the idea that we can have really about 150 actual relationships, and that's kind of like your brain runs out of space after that. But he describes our human relationships as a set of concentric circles that have the same center. And he starts with our intimates, our loved ones, our close friends, then our friends, and so on. And so here's an illustration of that. You may not be able to read it if you're not standing up here with me, which is none of you. But this is what it says. The artist is Emmanuel Lafont, but it starts with 5 loved ones. It actually starts with 1.5 intimates, but we'll skip that one. But 5 loved ones. These are the people that if something happens at 2 a.m., you can call them and they'll show up. They're going to be there for you. The next 15 are good friends. Maybe you wouldn't call them at 2 a.m., but you could call them at 2 p.m., right? And they're still going to be there. After the next circle, you've got 50 friends, 150 meaningful contacts, 500 acquaintances, and 1,500 people you can recognize, but maybe not. I wonder if recognition equals remembering name. Anyway, Dr. Dunbar didn't share that part, at least in what I read. But as you're thinking through this, looking at the circles in your life, and if you've got the sermon notes on paper, this is on the back, and so you can look at that. If you're on the app doing the fill-in notes, it's at the bottom. But I wonder if you just think about who are the loved ones, who are that core 5 in your life, the people that you would call if something happened in the middle of the night. And just think through who are those people. You can even write them down if you've got it on paper. And then as you expand that out, who are the next 10? Because each circle fits in the other. I had to do that math before I got it. But who are the next 10? Who are those people who are good friends, maybe not the ones that you're kind of ride or die, as they say, but who are the next group? And then who are the people who are the next 35, kind of your friends, but not at that deep level? And I wonder as you think through those people who are closest to you, how like you are they? Are they all the same political group? Are they all the same income level, kind of net worth? They have the same education level, same background, same ethnic group. Are they like you, or are there people who are not like you? Whenever I look at mine, there's a disproportionate number of people who have a Master of Divinity degree. That's not representative of the general public. I have too many pastor friends, but anyway, I'm working on spreading that out. They are weird, and so. But as you think through that, who are the people in your circles? Who are the people just like you? And who's missing? Who's missing? What would it look like for your circles to expand and include new people? This is what Bishop Berlin says. He says, Jesus doesn't tell you where you're going or who you will have to love. If you had that information, you might never take the journey. But without those companions and without that journey, we will never become the people God intended us to be. We need those people, even the ones who drive us crazy. And maybe you've thought before, I could be a better person if I just didn't have to deal with those people, you know, the ones who drive me crazy. Maybe over the snow weekend, whenever you haven't left your house much, if you've got little kids, you've thought, I could really just grow in our relationship if I did not get asked for a snack every 3 minutes, no matter if I say yes every time. Anyway, I might be projecting a little bit, right? But we think like if I just didn't have to deal with these frustrating situations that I had, or if I just didn't have that coworker who was so obnoxious, who listens to the radio the entire time and has apparently never heard of headphones, like if I just didn't have them, then I could really grow. And here is the thing, people are not obstacles to spiritual growth, they're the way. They're the way. And if you're a parent and wishing that you had more time to meditate and pray, actually the children who keep you from doing that are the ways that God is helping you to grow. And becoming a monk is not going to help you. You got to take care of your kids. Maybe preaching to myself here. And if you're someone who's like, if I just had coworkers who had the same values that I did and who saw things the same, then it would be really great. And it may be that God has put them in your life to help you both. The people that God has given us are the way that God is helping us to become people of love. It's like patience. It doesn't happen, like you don't become patient by never having anything that tries your patience, right? I mean, you've got to learn through a lot of situations that would tend to make you impatient. We don't become loving by never being exposed to people who are hard to love. We become loving by loving people, and particularly the people who are hard to love. And I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but you are that person for someone. Just probably, statistically speaking, it is likely. So just that's a good reminder for me, is that I am that person for someone. And so here's some action steps I want to challenge you to take this week alongside of me. And first is just to notice inside, what are the feelings that emerge whenever you take a look inside? If you're in a situation like Peter and imagining Jesus coming and just being right there in the boat, what are those feelings of self-rejection that tend to bubble up? What are the things about yourself that you tend to think, oh, I'm so unworthy, I don't deserve to belong, right? What are those tight pants moments in your life? What is that? And as you notice those, we have to notice them. They don't get better because we ignore them, right? Denial is not a great strategy most of the time. Invite God to heal and forgive those pieces of yourself that you reject. And as you become more and more able to love yourself, then God helps you become more and more able to love others. And so pay attention to the people God brings you into your life, and particularly the ones that you would not have chosen. That you're like, I don't know why I keep running into this person. I just got to take a different path whenever I'm going to my office or whatever that is. That might actually be God trying to get your attention. Say, I know this is not the person that you've chosen, but this is the person that you need to become the person that I've created you to be. And more as we say yes, we become people of love, and we accept that love for ourselves, and then we share it with others. And because we share it with others, then they can accept it for themselves again. We can become people who share the reckless love of Christ with all the world. Will you pray with me? God, we're so thankful that you have accepted us, no matter how unacceptable we may seem to anybody else, no matter how unacceptable we may be to ourselves. And you've told us that we belong. You've made us family. And so help us to accept that invitation. Help us to remind ourselves whenever we forget. And help us extend that invitation to others whom you have called, who you love. We thank you that Jesus perfectly embodied this, that he accepted all people and invited them to follow him, and that he showed us the extent of love whenever he gave himself. And as he taught us, so we pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.